Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore Presents. This time we're going to be chatting to Suki Ferguson, who is the author of Young Oracle Tarot, An Initiation into Tarot's Mystic Wisdom, which was published in 2022, and Astrologica, an encyclopedia of myths and legends from the planet, stars, and skies, which came out this year in 2025. She lives in London, where she can be found reading tarot while swimming and appreciating local flora and fauna. And in this chat, we're going to be having a look at some of the myths associated with the celestial bodies. We're going to be having a look at how you approach myths when you don't want to just focus on the Greek and Roman ones, and what can we learn from looking at the night skies. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to Fabulous Folklore. How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm not too bad. I'm very glad that it's Friday, I must admit. That's always a nice point in the week because I don't work Fridays.
Brilliant.
Obviously, we're here to talk about your very excellent new book. When did this come out?
It came out at the start of October, so yeah, it's only been out a couple of months now.
Yeah,
So
it's so pretty.
it
And
really is.
obviously, it's what does the tagline say? It's an encyclopedia of myths and legends from the planet, stars, and skies. So, obviously, big fan of all of those things here on Fabulous Folklore. But what actually drew you to write about star and planet myths?
Well, I've always been interested in mythology, and I've worked with Quarto, the publisher, in the past. I made a book about tarot for them, a non-fiction guide for teens and tweens. And they actually approached me to suggest writing a follow-up book to their very popular book by Steve Kershaw called Mythologica, which looked at 50 gods, goddesses, and monsters from classical myth. And the initial idea was to really focus in on star signs and the zodiac. But in developing that idea, we went broader and I wanted to include more about the constellations more broadly, as well as the myths behind the planets and the stars. But that was our starting point, looking at those myths behind the constellations, the stars, and yeah, just looking at the skies and but with an eye on storytelling.
Hmm. Yeah. And obviously, lots of the stars, constellations, and obviously indeed planets have lots of different stories attached to them and like different versions and things. So, how did you go through those and decide which ones to include? Did you decide to just combine any, or were some of them you're like, no, that's not suitable, that can go over there? Like, how did you decide which ones you were going to use?
Yeah, that was a really fun part of the process. So the initial brief was to research Greek myths and Roman myths, which I love doing. But then all these other stories come up around these things, and they're so fascinating. And also, for me, like less familiar. So there was a lot of curiosity about the multiplicity behind the stories. Um, and so we decided to expand the brief of the book and go beyond the zodiac, the tropical zodiac, which was just, the starting point. Um, and that meant including the Chinese zodiac. I also spent time researching the Mayan zodiac, but it is a very complex system, and even just including how the Mayan calendar system works was like quite a big project. So, yeah, it was a matter of kind of complicating the myths and also just kind of looking beyond Europe as well. That was important.
Yeah, because I think I mean, a lot of the books, I suppose, focus mostly on the European ones because we've got
Mm.
most of them written down, I'd imagine. But obviously, that doesn't mean just because we have them that what we should focus on.
Hmm. Yeah, also things like the planets, they had the myths kind of retroactively attached to them as more was discovered uh, by astronomers.
Hmm.
So it's not carved in stone that Venus is about Venus, if you know what
Mm.
I mean. And in different cultures, those planets and which were interpreted as stars have completely different meanings. So, for example, Venus in Mayan civilization was associated with war and luck. So you wouldn't go to war uh, if Venus was not apparent in the sky, for example. So it had a very different meaning for that culture. And it was important to kind of include that perspective. And obviously, whilst also in that process, acknowledging that it's not possible to include every single, I mean, it would be lovely. That would be the best project ever to kind of do a complete kind of compendium. But yeah, to kind of include something that suggests those angles felt really important.
Yeah. And also, I'd just like to point out one of the things I was really pleased to see is the fact that you still included Pluto. I
Yeah.
love Pluto. As like an astronomy nerd, I love Pluto, so I was like, yay, Pluto's still in there.
Yeah, it was an interesting one because, I mean, when I was in school, Pluto was still classified as a planet. I knew that it was declassified. Going back and kind of spending time with why that was really interesting. And obviously, the children who'll be reading this book will be way ahead of me on that anyway. But yeah, then thinking about the myth that is attached to that is so fascinating because there's potentially apocryphal interpretation of Pluto's, like Hades, the word in Greek, is associated with not being seen, being invisible. Um, and it just kind of it chimes with the whole story of Pluto or Hades and the underworld, um, being the god that was assigned that place of darkness and ruling it, but also not being in the light. And
Hmm.
it's funny because Pluto is was classed as a planet because it is very visible in comparison to other objects around it, but it is actually part of a kind of asteroid collective rather than a planet in itself. So yeah, that interesting process of promotion and demotion feels present for that particular celestial object in a way that is echoed in the myth, which is completely, it wasn't anticipated that it would go that way when it was named.
Yeah, I think it's just I remember when I first came across like the Holds to the Planet suite, and I was like, "Where's Pluto?" And then I realized obviously he composed it before they actually discovered Pluto, which would explain why Pluto's not in there. But that's I love the Planet suite. Um, so obviously we've touched a little bit on the fact that there's a lot of cultures, and obviously I like the fact that you've got sort of things from the Pacific in there as well. Why do you think so many cultures actually have myths about the heavenly bodies?
Mm. Yeah, this was a great thing to spend time reflecting on because I really wanted to give it a sense of the scale of time. Um, and ultimately, way before anyone can remember, way before anyone recorded anything, the main thing that people would have to look at once it got dark at night would be the stars. And the idea of spending time looking up and telling stories about the stars is so powerful. And also, I found it lovely to realize that so many of those stories reflect our life here on Earth. It's not really about looking at the stars and wanting to escape, which I think is quite a common, it's become a kind of common trope in the last century. Like, how do we get off this planet? How do we get to Mars? But if you go right back to prehistory and the first recordings of the stars, a lot of the reflection is about, oh, it looks a bit like this animal that we really treasure and rely on, for example. So in South America, there's dark cloud constellations said to resemble a llama. In the Pacific, that same constellation might be resembling a fish. In Australia, it might be a stingray. So it's so important for each culture to look at the stars and recognize what felt important for them and what felt integral to their lives and essential for survival, but also a character in their day to day.
Hmm. So do you think that looking at these other cultures and how they obviously find reflections of sort of life on Earth, as it were, in the sky, is why it is so important to kind of move just beyond whatever Greece and Rome said about them?
Yeah, yeah. I think there's so much to learn from each culture, and I don't think that there is a sense of I don't have that sense of hierarchy around Greece and Rome and having like the best myths. Like they're very famous myths, but that's because we're in a quite a Eurocentric culture. So I wanted to approach it with a global um, mindset whilst also recognizing that I don't have a foot in any of the cultures, really. It's not like many of the myths are famously connected to the UK, which is where I'm from. So I wanted to approach it with some humility as well in that respect, and not like put any particular culture on a pedestal. At the same time, I was interested in looking at animism in the myths. So I think only one of the spreads focuses on Christian interpretation of a constellation, which is Crux. But there's many interpretations of it, and some of those are, for example, uh, indigenous to Australia, and like I mentioned, the stingray imagery. Um, so that's important. And in Inca imagery, it would be a portal to, the other world. So it didn't get to include everything in the book in that way, but I do find that ancient kind of nature lore very important to include. And I think there's enough awareness of the more modern takes of like Christian faith or what Greeks and Romans said. So kind of holding that awareness in mind and going where I had less familiarity. Uh, I hope that the reader could kind of enjoy that curiosity alongside me.
Mhm. I think one of the things that we obviously have a Eurocentric view, like you say, but there's also a tendency to kind of focus on the Northern Hemisphere. So that's where all
Mhm.
the most of the constellations that we would be familiar with because we're in the Northern Hemisphere. Was it more difficult to find legends for the Southern Hemisphere, or are they because some of the constellations have obviously moved and dipped below the equator, so they used to be Northern Hem and all that kind of thing. When you start getting into the astronomy of it all, it gets a bit confusing. So was it easy to find things in the Southern Hemisphere?
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, so for example, Crux is on many flags in the Southern Hemisphere. So Brazil features it, Australia features it. Um, yeah, it's very famous and the image is very beautiful. Um, so some of them were, there was a lot of richness around it. And then there's also a sense of absence there. So I've been researching myths connected to South America for a while. And it is very difficult to find really good original research that is translated into English. So that is a challenge. And I spend some time like running translations of Spanish and Portuguese text as a result. And I'm aware that same issue applies in every context. So yeah, if I wanted to find out more from other nations and from different languages, that same challenge applies. So I do feel a sense of patchiness, and I did want to kind of, I did think about trying to include something from each continent, but there's certain sensitivities in others, in one continent from another. So holding that in mind was important, and trying to get a sense of like which stories felt like they wanted to be shared and told, and which maybe didn't.
Mm,
That was part of the decision as well.
yeah, and I suppose obviously some of the stories associated with them, obviously depending on where they're from, but they can be a little bit sort of dark, as it were. But obviously because the book is for I've got younger readers. What is the actual age range? Well, I mean, I loved it, and obviously I'm in my early 40s, but like, what's the age range of it properly?
Yeah, it's for ages 8 and upwards, but
Okay.
I've seen friends with 6-year-olds like enjoying it as a bedtime read, and I think it's up to the discretion of the parent in that respect, because like you said, there are some dark themes, and any book that looks at Greek and Roman mythology has to kind of contend with that. Um, and I kind of manage that in quite an active way. So I did write with children in mind, even though there is no upper age limit on this book. Anyone of any age, I think, could enjoy it up, once the reading comprehension is there. But I did think about it because, so for example, as a child, I read a lot of books where there would be somebody would get seduced, and I was like, I don't know what that means. So a Greek myth or Roman myth, like Zeus seduces so and so, and I'm like, okay, that sounds cool, I guess. And I really wanted to avoid that word writing this book. Every time it came up, which is frequent because use
Yeah.
is use, um, every time that kind of dynamic came up where in this essence what is happening is not consensual between Zeus and whoever he is preying upon, um, I chose to focus on the lack of reciprocity in a kind of indirect way. So, for example, the case of Europa. She walks in a meadow. She befriends a bull that she sees there. The bull turns out to be Zeus. He carries her away and they have children. So, in that case, I've described it as Zeus fell in love with her and kidnapped her. And in time, they had children. So that's my way of kind of stepping with care around that story because, on one hand, I don't want to reinvent the myth and say they fell in love. I don't want to overly introduce dark themes for young readers. So it's a matter of kind of reframing things in a feminist way that was important throughout, and also in a decolonial way. Like I'm not writing to kind of prize Eurocentric culture. So yeah. But also I remembered as a child, not only was I curious about what does seduced mean, I also loved dark themes. So I devoured horrible history books, loved horrible histories. And the gorier the better, the darker the better. And I don't know if that's a strange thing for children, but I think it's fairly common. So I definitely wanted to kind of acknowledge that experience of childhood as well, which is sort of before you have a sense of how the world might operate. You're just kind of curious about like, oh, that's really scary and interesting. So I kind of leaned into that as well. So when there was conflict and violence, really, in the stories. I didn't want to shy away from that. I wanted to kind of share it in a way that felt approachable for a child, but also not like harrowing.
Mm. Yeah, I think there is a thing I think where I mean I remember as a kid loving horrible histories as well. And
Hmm.
anywhere you'd go anywhere, if there was like the ickier the stuff was, the better. So I sort of
Yes.
feel like there is like possibly a natural curiosity there. And obviously as they get older they can then learn other
Hmm.
variations of the story, I suppose. Um
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as a child, I was obsessed with Egyptian
mm,
mummies and pyramids and all of those things. And then more recently, when I've seen mummies in museums, I felt like a really deep sense of discomfort and unease and horror almost. So these things change, and I don't want to presume on a child's view of the world and say, you must absorb the horror now, aged 8. Because I trust that these things come with time.
mm,
If, it's like as a child, I read a lot of things that were anti-feminist, probably written from quite a colonial and racist point of view. But I've grown up to question those things and interrogate them. So, whilst I'm presenting things in a feminist and decolonial way where I can, I'm also trusting that children work stuff out.
mm. Yeah. And I think, that there's time for the horrors of late stage capitalism to come as well.
Exactly,
Something to
exactly.
look forward to.
Yeah, yeah. It's a quest that you go on.
And I think this is the thing as well. One of the things that I always find, particularly where like folklore's concerned, and you might learn a version of a folk tale when you're little, and then you learn the darker version or what it actually meant when you're an adult. You do then get to know both versions of the story. It's not like you have to forget one and remember the other. Well, no, you get to have both of them. So I think,
Yeah.
particularly even just given the sheer number of myths that there are about, for example, Taurus or like Pisces has umpteen as well, you think, well you haven't just learned one, you can learn others, but then that means you can
Mm,
also learn the darker versions of them as well. So you can hold all of them in your head at once.
yes. Yeah, I do feel like there is no absolute
Mm.
version. That is the fun thing about myths. It's also, I understand where there is something to be respected in the storytelling, but equally, there is quite a lot of like really explicit stuff in Greek and Roman myths, and I think most of us wouldn't have come across that unless we sought out a dusty tome in a library later in life. So, yeah, there is no kind of like one perfect telling. Although I do feel like a sense of responsibility with the myths from outside of Europe in a way that I don't feel. I feel with the European myths, I can be a bit more playful and reinterpretative with them. Um, Whether or not that's right, I don't know. But but yeah, I think I do approach them with a slightly different kind of research lens.
Mm. Yeah, there's a tendency where you come in, oh, Zeus, every time you come across something that he's done, but you wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable doing that with
Yeah.
anyone
Well,
outside of Europe.
there is in the section which is about Jupiter, aka
Mm.
Zeus, kind of can't really write about the myths of Jupiter without summarizing a degree of how much is going on there. So the artwork for Jupiter is kind of reflects how much
Yeah.
horror everybody's feeling about Zeus. So there's Ursa the bear, who a woman he turns into a bear, and there's Ganymede.
Hmm.
Yeah, the Aquarius myth is a boy that he captures. So yeah, it's like we kind of leaned into it. Like I was supported by the editors to kind of go there with
Mm.
offering a bit of a critique of the toxic masculinity of
Mm.
Zeus, not in so many words in the text, but that is present and it's a theme. Like I do feel like the book is a critique of toxic masculinity and a celebration of male figures who aren't embodying that. So the Sagittarius myth is much
Mm.
more positive, because it's about a satyr who brings applause to the world because he's applauding the graces, and it's just a different kind of um, it's a different feeling entirely.
Mm. Yeah, very much so. I think that's why one of my favorite of the Greek deities was actually always Hestia, because you find it's very difficult to find anything negative about Hestia.
Hmm.
You only sort of consider like, Athena's turning people into spiders and Juno's, well, Hera's being Hera.
Yeah.
Although kind of sort of for obvious reasons. But then yeah, I think Hestia was kind of just kind of potless about doing a thing, and I just also think there's something lovely and homely about her.
Yeah, this is it. Yeah. And there is interesting complicity between, like you mentioned Hera or Juno. It's like that thing of enforcing on behalf of a destructive male tendency. If Zeus is out cheating, then and she takes it out on the women, then that's also I include that in my critique of like the toxicity of gender norms
Mm.
in the book. So yeah, it was fascinating to kind of read the myths through these lenses and then also have the opportunity to share them in a way that feels helpful and healthy from my perspective as well.
Yeah. Because I think people might be more familiar with the stories of the tropical zodiac compared to maybe some of the constellations. I
Hmm.
mean, I would imagine something like Ursa Major, people will either know it as the bear or the plough, or
Hmm.
the Big Dipper. It'll be one of the three. Um, but of the zodiac origin stories, have you actually got a favorite? And I know that's a horrible question to ask because you've got like 12 to choose from, but have you got a favorite among them?
Yeah, it's funny because I'm Capricorn, so you would think I would choose that myth, but actually my favorite was Cancer. So it tells the story of the great crab. Um, and actually, first read of that myth, I was like, how do I write this for children? The crab dies, and she's also kind of a monster who attacks Hercules, who is the hero of the myth. Um, but if I looked at it from her perspective, she's kind of minding her business and living her life without being bothered by the gods. And Hercules comes along and completely ruins the piece. So I kind of wrote it from her perspective in order to explore what that was like and also to celebrate like the connection that she had with the Hydra, who she was defending, who Hercules was there to slay. So yeah, it was um it was interesting to explore from that angle. So that one's the one that stayed with me most in this project.
Mm. It's funny, really. I don't often think that Hercules comes out of a lot of stories particularly well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they kind of the Disney film does a good job of making him likable enough, and that's fine. And I did love reading Hercules Myths as a child. They were beautifully illustrated books. that told his, the myths of his 12 labors. So in a way, I have a sort of vestigial affection for him, but on revisiting, that's kind of gone. So yeah, in terms of writing, yeah, if your star sign is the crab, like we're kind of not on Hercules' side in that particular story.
Mm.
And the same with Leo.
Well, yeah, very much. That's the thing. I was always quite surprised when I first read the Leo one because the lion doesn't necessarily get given the attributes you'd expect a lion to really have. It kind of almost gets like, what's the word, diminished in favor of
Hmm.
Hercules. And I'm like, it's an almost invincible lion. This is cool.
Yes, yeah. It's like it's got a golden skin that can't be pierced by any normal object. It's like it's a very cool lion. So yeah, I think it's a bit of Leo energy there, and that it's a very special lion. But yeah, the fact that it's Hercules' next victim kind of thing is also it's a fact of the myth. So it was one of those things to work with in the retelling.
Mm, yeah.
It's also, I didn't want to like overly focus on it as a kind of horoscope guide because I think as a child, it's kind of interesting, but also it's not as interesting as adults find it. Um, I think it's become like a kind of cultural phenomena as, for millennials and Gen Z. And maybe as a kid, it's sort of like you don't need your personality to be summed up in that way. Um, and
Mm,
I didn't feel helpful to really dwell on those things, especially when in the myths, uh, some of the characters which the myths, the star signs are about, do have quite adversarial relationships.
hmm Yeah, and I think that was the other thing I was going to ask, because obviously there has been this growth in interest in astrology quite widely. Obviously, people practice different types of astrology, whether that's kind of the more Hellenistic one, where it's looking back to the ancient Greek sort of techniques and so on, and what have you. Um, and do you think something like that would be what we might consider a trend, albeit an incredibly long-running one, which is unusual for anything involving social media? Or do you think that people are just engaging with the world around them in different ways? Or is it just something that people have always been interested in because there's always been astrologers to some degree?
Yeah, it's a great question. Um, my perception is that people are more interested in trying to understand themselves more than perhaps in the past in any other history I can think of. I do feel that astrology and astronomy is kind of touched on in the book, actually, like the differences between them and how they fed into each other. I do think that in the earlier millennia of what was astrology, it was more outward looking. It was more, okay, what are the positions of the stars in the sky? Does that mean we should plant seeds now? Is the rain going to come? Will the crops be right at the right time? Like that was why people paid so much attention to the stars, and then told stories about them to help remember, like, oh, the plow is at this position. It's maybe a good time to plant the seeds. So I think it was more outward looking for a long time. And the more recent phenomena of star signs, I think, since the kind of the dawn of the age of Aquarius, yeah, the countercultural era of the 1960s and 70s, that's when I think the kind of modern narrative around looking at astrology to kind of understand ourselves is when it's kind of really rooted. And I think it's great to see it kind of explode and like how people engage with it is so fun and varied and often very like witty about this kind of quest to understand yourself in relation to others. But um, but yeah, I think it is a relatively modern thing, and I think that there's maybe a millennial interest and Gen Z interest in finding those categories to assign yourself to, because there's maybe a feeling of like maybe not getting feedback from older generations, except in a negative way potentially.
Mm,
So it's a little side way of engaging with that. But whether that will continue at the rate that it currently does, I don't know. Um, but it is amazingly universal, considering that it is, you know, uh, something that's rooted in Greek and Roman myth,
mm.
essentially.
I found it was really interesting when I was looking at oh, it was one of the old farmers' almanacs, and it had a whole section in it about planting according to what sign the moon was in. So ignoring
Hmm.
sun signs, moon signs was the one to go with. And Amaya Rourke, who I've actually had on the podcast before, sort of taught me how to do this. And I actually did try planting some seeds according to the moon sign, and it made such a difference. I did also try planting
Mm.
during an eclipse, which you're not really supposed to do. And my God, it was like this monstrous sort of, I think it was just microgreens I was growing, but the level of growth
Wow.
that you got in like 3 days was insane. So I was like, I can see why people, and particularly gardeners or farmers, would be like, any advantage I could get, I'm
Hmm.
going to go with. And it was just really cool to see this quite, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know how it'll work with climate change, whether it'll continue to
Mm.
work, but it was almost this predictable thing of, if I plant in this particular, when the moon's in this sign, I will get this particular result. And as I have no idea how that works.
Hmm.
Um, but it seemed to. So that's
Yeah.
kind of where I quite like it, when things like that appear in something really practical, like a farmer's almanac, and then it's like,
Hmm.
plant in these steins and this will happen. And I love that. I just thought it was really cool. Um,
Yeah, it
and
is really fun to see where the tropical zodiac appears in places you would not expect. So the Farmer's Almanac is a fun one. I hadn't heard of that. Another one where I was really blown away when I saw it was cathedrals in Venice, for some reason, had all of these zodiac signs like plastered all over them. And I researched it as part of writing this book, and it was because of those agricultural calendars and also planning Easter.
mm,
It depended on where the moon was. And the same with Ramadan, it depends on the moon. And the moon isn't a planet, but it's so important
mm.
and definitely key to this book because so many different cultures measure by the moon or by the sun or a bit of both if you're yeah, so it's like completely integral to how we understand our days, our weeks, our months, the seasons, and those moments in time for taking action or stepping back.
Well, that's why I quite like the amount of work that seems to be getting done, where people are looking at like megaliths and, stone circles and things like that. And I know they're doing this with Stonehenge to check, is it actually a lunar calendar rather than a solar calendar? Because a calendar
Hmm.
that's only useful twice a year doesn't necessarily seem like it would be hugely useful, particularly if you
Hmm.
weren't aware of the concept of a year. Whereas one that was useful every month, to me, sort of feels like it might have a bit more value. So I love the fact that people are going, maybe we've been looking at the wrong celestial body. And I always think, well,
Hmm.
yeah, because, and the moon, you can't miss it unless, of course, it's cloudy like it was last night. So all these photos of the
Mm.
full moon looking amazing, and except in Newcastle where it's just cloud, which happens every time there's a phenomenal celestial event. It will be cloudy.
It will. It will. It's definitely something I've encountered. Yeah, I think the moon is and the sun are such an interesting duo because, like, for example, in the Mayan temples, uh, they're constructed according to the solstice lighting the inner chambers. So they had a ceremonial significance. But that's not to say that the moon wasn't also paid attention to at the same time. And in a lot of Native American indigenous different nations, there'll be time will be categorized according to the moon. So it'd be like this is the cold moon, the moon of the shedding pony fur. It's like each micro season is measured in the moon, um, and the sun is there. So yeah, it can have a kind of ceremonial versus practical kind of division. Yeah, it's really interesting to look at.
There's quite a few cultures where the sun and moon are siblings as well, aren't they, in the myths, where they're either twins or they're just brother and sister. And I always think it's like people almost had worked out that there was a relationship between the two,
Mm.
even if they didn't quite know through physics what that actually was.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I've been researching mythologies of Amazon uh, indigenous peoples, and there's a lot of crossover between the sun being masculine, the moon being feminine, them creating the earth together, them being brother and sister and creating the earth together. And there's all kinds of like these things, and then you see these in other cultures that would never have crossed paths with anyone from the Amazon. And there's a lot of interesting things of the sun being male, but also there are still instances of the moon being male, and often characterized as like a fat man who gets too fat and then has to get thin again, or something like that. So there isn't a monolithic interpretation of the sun and moon, but they are always integral,
Mhm.
whichever culture you look at.
Yeah, very much so. And this is a weird question, but do you have a favorite planet, especially in terms of the stories associated with them, or is there one that you just think is really cool? I know we touched on Pluto earlier, but are there any others?
Yeah, well, Pluto's probably my favorite of the planets. But in terms of writing about the kind of our particular solar system, it's it's I mean, it sounds really basic to say it, but the Earth.
Mm.
So it sounds like almost not even worth acknowledging, because we're so in it. But in researching the other planets, you see how precious the Earth is and how the conditions that are present here are not present anywhere within our reach, um, which really, I don't know, for me, it really affirms how important it is that we take care of this planet and also appreciate the wonder of it. So that's something I've really worked to convey in the book, not just on the page about the Earth, but everywhere throughout it. But yeah, speaking about the Earth, yeah, there's the Gaia myth in Greek and Roman mythology, but I've also like focused on Pachamama. So in Andean culture in South America, Pachamama is the Mother Earth, and there's a real sense of respecting the earth as an elder, um, and someone who gives care, but also will be angry if not taken care of in a respectful way. So yeah, that was really nice to focus on when thinking about the planets.
Mm. It was nice to see the Earth in there actually, because obviously with a lot of astrology stuff being people looking at the heavens, obviously you can't really factor the Earth into that because you're standing on it. So you mean that like the Earth then disappears from astrology because it's at the
Yeah,
center of it. So it was really nice to go, yes, but it's still part of the solar system. I really
it
like the fact
is.
that the Earth was still in there.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that the first space missions to the moon really came back with, which was the idea of the pale blue dot, like alone in the universe, and how special that is. So all of these astronauts who trained um, to go forth and explore and conquer the universe came back and were like, wow, this is really important what we have here.
Mm.
So that's really, I think that's like a lovely thing to remember.
Hmm. I think it's also a nice message to leave everyone with. So, last question is, what are you working on now, and where can people find you online?
Yeah, so at the moment I'm working on I make tarot decks as well as write books for children, and I have a tarot deck coming out quite soon, which is focused on symbolism. It's actually going to be for adults. My first piece of writing for adults. So my first book was about tarot, and that was for young people. My first tarot deck was for young people. Astrologica is for young people and everyone. But symbolic tarot, it's I'm working with an artist who I've worked with before, and we've just looked at the symbolic richness of particular imagery and objects that we may see every day or feel very familiar with. And we've used those associations to develop a kind of a tarot deck which can be used for self-guidance. An example being, say, an apple. Um, that it teaches is associated with knowledge and forbidden knowledge, but it's also why. Why is an apple so associated? And I've presented it as being something where you can only really know something experientially. You don't know if an apple is truly good until you bite it, and then you know
Mm.
instantly. So it's that thing of like understanding something theoretically and then understanding something experientially, like you kind of need both. And there's power in that. And then after that, I've got with the same artist, so Anna Nova, who I've worked with the tarot book and these decks. Uh, she proposed that we do a oracle deck about the mythologies of the Amazon, which is uh, her home country, Brazil, is has a lot of the Amazon rainforest in it. Um, So I've been working on that, which is in the same vein of researching mythology. Um, Very challenging. As I mentioned, all the translations of Portuguese and Spanish, but there are over 100 indigenous dialects and languages spoken in the Amazon. The Amazon crosses 9 different nations. Yeah, there's absolutely no way in one lifetime that any one person could research all the mythologies of it, but that's part of the fun of
Mm.
grappling with something like that. It's like, okay, so there's a restriction here. Anna is representing these myths. This is what we can learn from that, and also the natural history. So, yeah, spending time thinking about the symbolism of, say, a capybara or a jaguar is also part of that. So, in these projects, it's always about looking at the natural world and trying to understand ourselves
Mhm.
better in it. And the same is true of like looking at the stars and being thinking about why we tell these stories about what's back here. So it's all kind of thematically connected. Um, yeah. And then in terms of where to find me, I have a an account on Instagram, Mirror Tarot. So yeah, my Instagram account is Mirror Tarot, and I share updates about my writing, tarot, and I also offer tarot readings there as well. But yeah, I'm not very active on social media. So it is definitely like I welcome anyone who looks me up, and it's really great to connect with people and also hear about how they feel about the book. So it gives me an incentive to log on and realize that my work is out in the world and being read, and it's a really nice thing to realize because I am a bit of a reclusive author. So yeah, it's my little contact with the world.
Mhm. But it's been absolutely marvelous chatting to you. I do hope that people go out and get a copy of this. Christmas is coming up.
Yes, it
It
is.
would look
Yeah.
good under a Christmas tree.
Yeah.
Just saying.
It is
Um,
beautiful. I mean, I'm not the artist, so I just want to
yeah.
shout out to Camellia Pham because her work is stunning. And if it wasn't for her and for Wide Eyed Press, everything I've just talked about would just be a Word document.
Mm,
So I can only celebrate the production values of the publisher and also, yeah, Camelia's
mm.
genius.
Yeah, it is a beautiful, and I know what it's like as well when you're the author and everyone tells you how beautiful the book is, and you're like, I didn't draw it.
Yeah.
The same thing happens with Rebel Folklore and Ghost Lore, and I'm like, yeah, the illustrations are amazing. I did the words. I know how that feels. So yeah, I've really really enjoyed reading it, and I like the fact that you've obviously included the constellations and the stars as well as just the zodiac, but it's a lovely looking book. And I think that it would, as I say, look good under the Christmas tree. Just saying.
Yeah.
Um it's been lovely chatting to you though. And I quite look forward to your new tarot deck because that sounds quite cool.
Mm,
Um
thank you. Yeah. No,
and
I'm excited about it too. And thank you so much for inviting me onto the podcast. It's wonderful and lovely to talk with you, I see.
but have a very Merry Christmas as well.
Yeah, you too. And yeah, thanks again.
Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hoped you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record, and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles, and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.